Let me know this. Does this sound like something you have problems with? When you throw your bait casters, continuously backlashing. It doesn't matter where you turn your dial on the side of your reel, you get a lot of backlashes. You go to make a cast, whoosh, line pops. You get a backlash, the line pops. All these line issues. You go to set the hook with your spinning rod. You go to set the hook, line pops when you set the hook. Or, we don't talk about this very often, but with a spinning reel, you're still getting bird nests. It's easy to get a bird nest when you're talking about a bait caster, but with a spinning reel, there's still opportunity for you to get what we call a bird's nest in that guy. Does that sound like a problem you're dealing with? A lot of times, the issue that you're having with line on your spinning rods and your bait casters, that has a lot to do with the line composition and the line sizes that you're using when you're out there fishing. I want to talk to you a little bit about what you could use to help solve some of those problems. Sometimes it's just using the right composition of line, the right style of line, whether that be braid, fluorocarbon, or even mono. We don't talk about that a lot in bass fishing. Mono is still a tool that you can use to get better results when you're out there fishing. Sometimes it's just that issue. Sometimes it's a line size issue. We're going to talk about the advantages of all. And I'm also going to show you how you can solve some of the spooling problems that you have. I've got a new machine here that I've been using to spool all of my reels with this year. It saves me time, and it also helps a lot of the issues that you're going to have with casting, because it puts pressure on the line, which stretches the line, makes it more usable when you're out there fishing. All right, here's the 3 basic styles or compositions of line that I like to use right here. Braided line. For the most part with braided line, I'm going to use 10 and 15 when I'm on my spinning reels. That's usually for a braid to fluorocarbon setup. I'll talk about why that's important here in just a little bit. With my bait casters, I'm going to use 50-pound tests, which is what this spool is right here. I'll use 50-pound tests, and I'll use 30-pound tests. I use 30-pound tests when I'm trying to make longer casts, usually with a frog, some type of presentation where I'm actually casting a bait out. Some of my top waters, 30-pound test braid. When I'm using 50-pound test braid, obviously that's going to be stronger. That's going to be bigger diameter line. That's going to be more for those power fishing techniques, flipping in heavy grass, any kind of short range fishing, sometimes still frogging, but a lot of times with frogging, I like to get my frog a long way from the boat. So that's when I use the smaller diameter line. But if it's something that's close, and if it's something that I know I'm going to be putting a lot of torque on my line, it's going to be the 50-pound test braid. So those are the 4 sizes of braid that I feel like are going to solve most of your problems when it comes to presenting your lures and going out there and catching fish and getting the results that you want. All right, let's talk about fluorocarbon and mono. Now, this is where it gets a lot more broad. I've got just about every size, all the way down from this 4-pound test all the way up to 25-pound test fluorocarbon and mono. We'll start at the smallest and work our way up to the biggest line. So if you are like to fish with panfish, sunfish, brim, crappie, 4-pound test, I found out mono is the best line to use for that. Mono is just a very soft material. It's very easy to cast. So when I'm using real small spinning reels, really light lures, with that line being much more manageable, easier to cast, the mono has just worked better for me. It casts the lure longer. It's just easier to manage on the reel. Now, I will say this, when comparing it to a braid to fluorocarbon setup, I do get more line twist and have to replace it more often, but mono is a fairly cheap line. It's not expensive. This spool right here is probably $7. 330 yards, it's trilene 4-pound test. That's what I use for that. Now, if I'm going to be fishing for bass and I'm getting into some of my more technique specific stuff, throwing a shaky head, throwing a drop shot, I'm going to then transition to a braid to fluorocarbon setup when using a spinning reel. All right, let's talk about that. Why would I use a braid to fluorocarbon setup with my spinning reels? If you've ever tried to spool up on your spinning reels, if I tried to take this spinning reel right here and I tried to spool up this 17-pound test fluorocarbon line, I'm going to use some intense language because this is so unmanageable. It's so coily, the material is so dense and so hard that it just wouldn't stay on the spool. It would immediately just want to jump off there like a slinky. The magic with braid to fluorocarbon is now I can use a very, very strong medium on the spool. This is 10-pound test braided line. I can then take the 17-pound test and tie that to the 10-pound test. Now I've got a very, very strong line to lure connection that I can put in bushes, grass, and muscle a fish out. I would never be able to put that line on this reel. So I use a very pliable, the braid is very supple, it's very limp, it's a smaller diameter, so I can use that on my spinning reel. And then I use a piece, just a small piece of fluorocarbon. It can be anywhere from 36 to 48 inches long. The way that I measure it, and I'll show you how I measure my fluorocarbon line when I'm doing a braid to fluorocarbon. It's very, very simple. This is how I've learned to measure it. I'll show it to you with this spool right here. It's a little easier to get it loose. I'll take my line, my spool line, and what I like to do is I grab it here and I'll go out one, then I go a half. I'll do that again so you can see it. I grab it at the end, grab the end of the line just like this, and I stretch my arms as far as they'll go. That's one. And then I'll do a half, just like that. I'll cut my line here, and then that's how much line that I use. That's about 5 foot, 5 or 6 foot. Usually during a day of fishing, that gives you plenty of leader line to retie if you break off, or if you just want to retie just to make sure you don't break line on your next hook set. Okay, so that's the advantage and purpose of using a braid to fluorocarbon setup. On my spinning reels, I've used as small as 6-pound test fluorocarbon and as big as 20-pound test when I'm saltwater fishing. A lot of times when I'm saltwater fishing, I'll use a 20-pound test fluorocarbon, braid to fluorocarbon setup, because that bigger material, 20-pound test, it just comes to the oysters and barnacles on docks much better than a smaller pound test and a 10 or 12-pound test line. When I'm talking about bait casters and we're using either a fluorocarbon or mono on my bait casters, I can use anything from 10-pound test all the way to 25. The sweet spot that I've found when I'm using fluorocarbon or mono on a bait caster where it's manageable and I don't get a lot of line twist and I don't get a lot of backlashes is anywhere from 12-pound test on the smaller end, and on the high end, the biggest line that I like to use is 25. 25 can be very unmanageable. The bigger the line gets, the harder it's going to be to manage. It's going to be a lot more difficult. It's going to be more coily. Fluorocarbon is a very dense material. It's going to be very coily. The sweet spot is really 12 to 20. In extreme cases, I use 25. I will never use on a traditional bass bait caster. I will almost never use anything bigger than 25, and I really don't like to go over 20. So that's a little bit about the line choices that you guys can use in your fishing. These line choices that I just mentioned to you work good for crankbaits. They work good for Texas rigs, Carolina rigs, reaction baits like jerk baits, topwater plugs. Obviously, for our topwaters, we're going to use a braid or we're going to use mono for the most part. There are some situations where I still use fluorocarbon for topwaters, but that's how you're going to choose your line choices for your bait casters and for your spinning reels. Now, an often overlooked area is how you actually put the line on the reel, and that's what we're going to get into next. I found a very good tool to help me spool up my reels. At times I'll have 30 to 40 setups in my boat, and it can take a lot of time to rig up each one at a time, and it can even take more time to strip off line off 20, 30, 40 setups. And I found this machine and I found it very valuable, and it solves a lot of problems. One of the things that you're going to have a lot of issues with when you're using bigger pound test line is making sure you have tension on the line as you spool it up. You know, we've used our finger to apply tension as we spool it up, but it's really hard to have the right amount of tension. Secondly, a lot of times you don't know how much line you're putting on the reel. And having a machine that measures the line and the amount that you're putting on there is going to save you time and take out the guesswork. Most of your reel manufacturers on the manual are going to show you exactly how many yards of each pound test that spool holds at best capacity. And having a machine that measures that is going to save you a lot of trouble, a lot of backlash, a lot of bird nests, and just a lot of user issues when you've got something to do that. This is my Triangle Sport SC125. This is a really small machine that I could use to spool up all my line, all my reels. I've been using it when I've been on the Tackle Warehouse Invitationals this year, and it's really helped me a lot. It saved me time, and I've seen where my line actually lasts longer because I get less kinks, I get less line twists because my line is spooled on my reel the right way. Every single time, the right amount of pressure, the right amount of line. It just solves a lot of my issues. Okay, you already know, stripping line off a lot of reels can take up a lot of time. One of the cool things about this Triangle Sport line winder is it will actually strip off the line off all my reels for me, and it does it really fast. Let me show you how it works. Now I've got this guy set up to actually spool reels, but we're gonna take one off and we'll strip line off of it. We'll strip some line off of a reel and spool one up just to show you how this thing works, how it's pretty smooth. All right, so we're gonna take off this piece right here. This is our bar. I'm gonna call it the reel bar. You can take this off. It comes with everything. You're not buying any extra equipment or any kind of bolts or anything like that. You don't need any wrenches. Everything works exactly the way it's supposed to. It comes with all the parts that you need. And surprisingly, it's pretty simple. You know how we are as men, you get something, you never look at the directions, you never look at the instructions. Well, it's pretty much the same. I didn't really have to look at a whole bunch to get this guy to work. I ain't saying you need to do it this way. I'm not telling you that you need to not use the instruction, but it's almost like using your cell phone. You know, when you buy an iPhone, they don't give you an instruction manual. There's nothing on it. You start flipping through there on your phone and checking it out and see how it all works. And you figure it out as time goes on. I'm not telling you that's what you need to do with your Triangle Sport, but it's pretty easy to use without going through all the instructions. So I got one of my bait casters we're gonna de-spool right quick. And all I'm gonna do, like I said, no wrenches, no tools, I don't need anything to make this work. I'm just gonna tie up my line on this spool right quick. You can just wrap it around. I've taken it and just wrapped it too, and it works just fine. Let me push this in here. All right, tighten that down. So you don't even have to tie a knot if you don't want to. You can just wrap it around 2 or 3 times. One of the reasons that I'm respooling this reel is look at that line. You see how it just coils up? That's what causes so many backlashes when it's coiled up. That's when you know it's time to respool the line. Now, I have a spool speed dial right here. I can go as fast as I want to or slow as I want to. I'm going to turn this low. I always start off low. Make sure you mash that button, because once you hit your foot pedal, that's going to start turning. And if you got it locked in, it's going to jerk your reel out of your hand. I just hold it right here. All right, you see how easy that is? I've got a foot pedal down here at the floor. And if I want to just really strip that line off real fast, all I got to do is just turn my dial right here, my left hand. Or she's turning 12,000 right now. Strip all my line off my spool. As I get to the end, and one thing I suggest, as you get to the end of that spool, you want to start to slow down, because obviously, if you've got a knot tied, sometimes I don't tie a knot. I actually either tape it or tie a really loose knot. If you don't, when you get to the end, it's going to jerk your reel out of your hand. All right, then you can take this apart, do away with your line. Look how fast that was. And then if we want to, and I can do several reels. I can do my bait caster, my spinning reels. I can do as many as I need to really fast like that. Now, we'll get ready to spool up a bait caster. I'm going to take some of these parts off and just set them to the side. Put my T-handle back in. This is where we're going to mount our reel. Got two little knobs here. I just like to try to have this bar level. Just like that. Okay, so we'll take our reel and we'll attach it to the line winder. It's pretty much just like attaching the reel to the reel seat on your rod. Just going to turn that clockwise until it tightens up. Don't go too tight. Just just finger tight. You don't have to. You don't have to get in here and get some pliers to get it tight. That's about as tight as you need it. For this reel right here, this is a custom light. Doesn't really, this particular reel, this is something I didn't mention, but depending on what bait caster you use, some reels hold bigger line better. This is a 13 fishing reel here. It has a much deeper spool. This is a loose custom light. It has a much shallower spool. These reels with the shallower spool, I feel like, are better suited for smaller pound tests. I would not ever use anything bigger than 20, and honestly, like 12, 14, 15, 16, 17 pound tests is going to be a better option for this reel. So with that being said, let's use this right here is some Sunline 14 pound tests. Let's use that on this reel. It's really easy to spool up your spools. Put that right there. Come in, put a little tension there. Put my line through that guide right there. And honestly, it probably would have been easier if I would have tied my line before to the spool before I put my reel on the line winder. That probably would have been ideal, but let's make it hard and interesting for y'all today. Okay, get it started. Now we're ready to start spooling. On the machine, it has a forward and a reverse. Obviously, when we're stripping line off of a reel, we want to use the reverse. That's how I just despool the reel that you just saw me take the line off of. Now that we're going to be spooling line onto a reel, we want to put it to the forward position. Like I mentioned, we also have a spool speed control. I always start everything, whether I'm stripping line or I'm putting line on a reel, I always start on the low position and I modulate the speed as I start to spool the reel. So let's turn that dial all the way to low. Apply pressure. Typically when you're spooling up a reel, the way we traditionally do it, you're gonna add tension with your fingers. You ever spool fluorocarbon, especially braid, they get hot. You got a lot of friction going between your fingers. We don't have to do that. We have a way to add tension to the line as we spool, which is the most important part, especially when you're dealing with difficult to deal with line, fluorocarbon. I don't care how high a quality fluorocarbon line you're using with, just the material itself is harder to deal with. And adding tension to the line is gonna make it a lot more user-friendly. And if you do that as you're spooling it, if you start off good, you end up good. So we're gonna add tension just by adding a little pressure to the spool right here. All right, let's go. Just a little bit of tension, real slow. Start off slow, just like that. It's not on the lowest frequency, it's not on the lowest speed, but pretty close. And I'm just adding tension with my right hand. My right hand, your left. Once I know everything's going good, I got everything lined up good, I can increase the speed. Okay. One really nice feature is I have a meter counter on this machine, so I know exactly how much line I'm putting on my reels. Then, as we always do, we'll just cut our line, take our reel off. And you can see how this can save you a lot of time, especially if you're doing a bunch of reels. If I need to go through every setup in my boat right now and spool them up with new line, this will save me a lot of time. Now, the good thing about it, I'll show you how you can strip line off of a reel. I'll show you how you can put line on a reel on a bait caster. You can also use this for spinning reels. So let's work on the spinning reel next. When we decide to strip the line off a spinning reel, it's a lot different than when I'm doing a bait caster. I'm actually going to take the spool off of the spinning reel. Pretty easy. Most spinning reels work the same way. I'm just going to take the drag nut off the top. Once I get that off, set the drag nut to the side. And just like how we did on the bait caster, I'm just going to attach my line. Let's get this guy set up here good. Good to go. Wrap my line around. I'll just wrap it around a few times. It usually locks in for me. Maybe sometimes this braid is a little slicker. You might have to put just an overhand knot in there just to make sure it grabs. As long as you start off slow and don't start off at 12,000 RPMs, you'll probably be okay. What you want to do is take that guy here. I just hold my spool. Make sure you put your guy in reverse there. I'm just gonna start stripping off line. The good thing about using braid on spinning reels too is you don't have to re-spool them very often. I can put 10 or 15 pound test braid on a spinning reel and it'll last me for the most part, unless I just start breaking off a lot or have a big catastrophic issue. Lasts me just about all year. Take that off. I love how the line just slips right off of there real easily. Set that to the side or put it in the trash. Now we're going to get ready to spool up our machine to use for the spinning reel. So we have a little dial here. Where did I put mine at? We're going to just slide this guy right here. All right. I've got a yellow rubber cap. I'm going to slide that over. Then in your machine, it comes with a little ball here as well. And you're going to use that to balance your spool with the spinning reel. I'm going to place him on here. Then I'm just going to add tension to it by sliding that support arm right into the spool. And this ball is going to keep everything balanced and even. I'm just going to apply a little pressure like that, tighten the nut. And now we're ready to start spooling. So with spinning reels, I do use straight fluorocarbon at times, but for most of the applications, probably 80% of the time, I'm going braid to fluorocarbon for the reasons that I mentioned. Get better hook set penetration. I'll use braid to fluorocarbon because it's more sensitive, and most importantly, well, there's really two most important things. Number one, it's way more manageable. I don't have to worry about line twist, bird nest, all those issues. They're going to have far less of them when I'm using braid on my spinning reel. Secondly is distance. So we got our 10 pound test braid. We're ready to put it on our spool. For a connection knot on my spinning reel, I just use what I would consider just a little clinch knot. I'm not really sure what it is, but it looks a little bit like what you're looking at on the video. However you got to get your line tied to your spool is really all it takes. It don't have to be anything fancy. I've even taped, back when I was a kid, I used to tape my fishing line to the spool. That works just fine too. So don't overthink this part. You just want to get something to get that line cinched down on your spool. Now some spinning reels will have a surface on the reel that will hold the line, hold braided line smoothly. Others won't. If it's a really slick finish on the spool, you may have to either A, use a little bit of backer material, which that could be mono or fluorocarbon, or B, what I usually do is I just put a strip or two of electrical tape on the spool so that when I go to cinch the line down, it has something nice to grab onto. But if it has a smooth finish, most likely it won't hold the line. Very important part, how the line comes off the spool. If it comes off the top, you want it entering or spooling onto the top of your spinning reel as well. So for this, we're actually going to put the spool in reverse. As always, we're going to start low and slow. Turn the speed control to low. Let's turn it up till it starts spinning. They give us a little handheld line guide that we're going to use when we're spooling the spinning reel. This just allows us to spool up the spool evenly so the line is not filling just one side of the spool. As always, turn your speed control all the way down to low. Get ready to get started here. Use your foot pedal. And just take that guide and just guide your line. Start off real slow until you get used to what you're doing. Very important to add pressure to your line so you get as much line on there as possible, and if you just add tension, it's gonna work a lot better when you get out there on the water and get the results that you need. Notice as well, you can see how the line is coming off the top of the filler spool and is going onto the top of the spinning reel spool. You always want to make sure that is going the same way. You wouldn't want it going off the top of the filler spool and then onto the bottom of the spinning reel. Now, as we get a little bit more comfortable with it, we can crank up the speed a little bit. And once you get used to it, you can fill up a spool like this in literally just seconds, especially with the spinning reel, because they typically don't hold that much line. I'm just gonna move it, just make sure that I fill that spool evenly. That's the most important part. Just move it along and fill that spool evenly. One of the biggest mistakes I see with people with spooling braided line or even fluorocarbon, it's even more important with fluorocarbon or mono, is they overfill the spool. With a spinning reel, that's the worst thing you can do. That's when you get those slinky problems where all the line wants to jump off the spool at once. I'd much rather you have too less line on your spinning reel than too much. You can notice on this spool it has a little purple bevel around the spool, and I want to leave a little bit of gap between the line and that that bevel right there, that purple bevel. It's kind of hard to say, but I would say somewhere about maybe a 1/16 of an inch or so, 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch. No, you don't want much more than that, but you definitely don't want it closer to that purple bevel than about a 1/16 of an inch. And we're getting pretty close now. Most important thing is just make sure you use that guide to fill it in where it's low and go back and forth. Getting close, we'll do right there. That looks good. Okay. I like to turn it off before I start, just in case my foot slips and hits the pedal. Take it off. We're ready to go. Put a rubber band, a piece of tape, whatever you need to put on your spool just to make sure it doesn't unspool. Most of your spinning reel spools has a little line keeper on the side of the spool. Just make sure you do that so you don't get it slinky off the top. Then you got to respool your line. It's hard to start over. I'll put my drag nut back on top, cinch it down, and you're ready to go. So you can tell this piece of equipment is a lot of fun to use. It's going to save a lot of time. I think even though it saves you time, the biggest thing for me is it ensures that I'm spooling all of my line, all of my reels correctly and consistently. The more consistently that I have spool tension, the more consistently that I have the same amount of line on my reels, the longer that line is going to last, the better results I'm going to get, the easier those reels are going to be able to use. So check these guys out. The Triangle Sport Linewinder. I think it's going to solve a lot of the problems you have with spooling your fishing line, your fishing reels, spinning, and bait casting.